This is Morecambe seafront in the summer of 1901. It was filmed by two pioneering filmmakers from Lancashire. "800 of these remarkable short films were recently discovered in the basement of a shop in Blackburn, but they were nearly lost forever. The films of Sagar Mitchell and James Kenyon take us to the world of ordinary people 100 years ago. They capture them going about their daily lives, leaving work, watching football, catching a tram in the rush hour. These films by Mitchell and Kenyon, who are based here at Blackburn, offer a unique glimpse into a remote Edwardian world. We'll look at life in the city, life at work, in an age before the cinema existed. But what interests me in particular are the people who appear in these films. What can these films tell us about their lives? At the beginning of the 20th century, these early film moguls ran their business from the back of a shop, marketing themselves with the slogans "local films" and "we take them and make them." Mitchell and Kenyon bought into a brand new technology: moving pictures. In this series, we're going to look at the unlikely story of these Lancashire businessmen and explore their films to find out what they can tell us about life 100 years ago. The films that Mitchell and Kenyon shot were of local people and local events. They weren't meant to be documentary records of the time, but were made purely for commercial reasons. Seeing yourself on screen was an amazing and almost magical event in those days, and people paid just to see themselves. What's fascinating for a modern audience is how much the films reveal about the people in them. Of course, as always, the more you look, the more you see, the more you begin to get the language of the age. You can decipher and understand and read the people in an almost eerie manner, actually. People loved being filmed. For many, it would be their only chance to be recorded for posterity. Though not everyone was so keen. Today we're used to being observed and documented: security cameras, bank transactions, driving licenses, dental records. But in 1900, things were very different for ordinary working people. They had birth certificates, death certificates, marriage licenses would be recorded, but otherwise, not much. These people could lead their whole lives and leave very little trace behind. But we have managed to track down the descendants of some of the people in these films.
To see my great-grandfather playing rugby in 1901 is just absolutely amazing. To see him running around, a man who was born 90 to 100 years before I was born, a man who died before I was born, to actually see him physically doing things is just incredible.
This is the Batley rugby team from Yorkshire. Mick Judge's great-grandfather, Paddy Judge, was a second-row forward.
Theo, your great-great-granddad's on here. He is. There he is, just going through now, just before the fella with the silly scrum cap. It's just bizarre that this match, 103 years ago near enough, and watching it like you're watching it today almost. Just can't believe that. I really can't get over the fact that they're wearing belts with the shorts. It's just incredible. And that the referee looks like he's dressed up for some sort of country walk rather than anything else. Looks like he's got probably +4s or wellies or something. Here I am watching the film with my year-old son on my knee, and here's the family stretching all the way back. You don't imagine that a member of your family who's not famous, who's not a politician or royalty or a hero or anything like that, it's almost unbelievable to see them moving around, to see them in the flesh in that sort of situation.
Between 1897 and 1913, the partnership of Mitchell and Kenyon made hundreds of these films. When the business finally folded in the 1920s, the original negatives were packed away in the basement of the shop. In 1994, after the shop had changed hands many times, builders were gutting the premises. Beneath years of accumulated rubbish were 3 large metal containers, which were about to be dumped on the skip. One man, local optician and film enthusiast Peter Worden, was fascinated by Mitchell and Kenyon's work. He was convinced that the films were lost somewhere in the shop. Fortunately, the builders looked inside the containers. They then contacted Peter Worden to see if he thought the films were worth keeping.
It occurred to me that this could very reasonably be the Mitchell and Kenyon films. And indeed it was. And then the task began of organising it and sorting it. So the problem then was what to do with the material, because how does one store over 850 rolls, as it turned out, of nitrate film, which of itself is highly inflammable? So then I thought, well, the most logical place to put these would be in as well-controlled a temporary environment as I could reasonably lay my hands on. And arrangements were made to transfer the material to the British Film Institute, who obviously had far greater capabilities than I could ever even begin to aspire to.
The British Film Institute stored the films in their vaults at the National Film and Television Archives Conservation Centre in Berkhamsted. The painstaking process of preserving and restoring the 800 negatives for the nation began. The films were shot on nitrate stock, which is notoriously flammable. The fact they were stored in a cool place for 80 years probably saved them from deteriorating completely, and had to be stored in a safe place before they could be restored. The storage cells are made out of reinforced concrete and have steel doors, all very bunker-like. Now let's go into one of the cells. This is where things get particularly interesting. Up here is a glass ceiling, and above my head are 6,000 gallons of water. The idea is that if a fire breaks out in here, the water will keep the room relatively cool. But if things get very bad and all these nitrate films ignite, then the ceiling is designed to be the weakest part of the cell. It will break and the flames will rush up and out rather than going to the cells on each side. The films were buckled and brittle, but crucially, they were the original negatives. The archivists knew that if they could restore them, the results would be amazing. Many of the films had to be printed frame by frame. At 960 frames a minute, the whole collection makes up over 1.5 million frames. The restoration project took just under 3 years. It is now one of the largest collections of early non-fiction films in the world. Before the discovery, Mitchell and Kenyon were thought to be minor players in early British film, but the find in the Blackburn shop has changed all that. It's put them at the centre of a large group of early filmmakers and has, quite simply, redefined the history of British film. Moving pictures were one of the technological breakthroughs of the late 19th century. The first moving picture machine was invented in America in 1892. The first film was shown to an audience in Paris in 1895. Cameras at this time were hand cranked. What we're used to watching from this period are films that are often at the wrong speed. The transfer process enables us to watch the films at virtually the speed they were meant to be shown. James Kenyon, seen here directing mill workers for the camera, went into partnership with Sagar Mitchell just 2 years after the first ever screening of a moving picture. Kenyon had originally made penny in the slot machines, and Mitchell was a photographer. When they set up business in Blackburn, they were right at the beginning of a brand new technology, the internet boom of its time. This was 10 years before Charlie Chaplin made his first movie. Even basic techniques like editing hadn't been developed yet. Like most films of the time, Mitchell and Kenyon's were usually one continuous shot with no close-ups, hardly any camera movement. They were also silent. Many of Mitchell and Kenyon's films were shot as people left work. They were able to pack their shots with as many people as they could squeeze into the frame. They were all potential customers. It was a real novelty to see moving pictures of yourself. They were advertised with posters, and leaflets were handed out giving the dates and times of the shows, proclaiming, "See yourself as others see you." These films would then be projected in fairground tents or local meeting halls because there were no cinemas yet. Now these films often have scratched on the first frame a bit of information about them. Now let's read this one. Ah yes, Haslam's Limited, Colne, when it was made January the 29th, 1900. So one assumes this is the name of the place being recorded. And let's have a go at another one. This one says, Platt's New Works, Oldham, August the 20th, 1900. So that's all the information we actually have about the films, and that's the information I have got to use to find out more about the people who appear in these films. Because these films were shot 100 years ago, none of these people are still alive. The best way to find out about them as individuals is to find their children and grandchildren. We sent images from some of the films to local Lancashire papers in the hope that someone would recognise one of the mills or factories. Ron Vickers got in touch with us about his grandfather, William Waterhouse, who worked at Glebe Mills when this film was shot.
That time my grandfather would be a young man of about 21 or 2 at this time, I would think. Well, this looks like it would be lunch hour, because some of them are taking baskets in to, I presume, their parents with their lunches, which was a feature of mill work in that era, because there were no canteens, and quite a lot of children used to take dinners in to the mill to their parents. My grandfather started as a half-timer in the mills when he was 10, having lost his mother in childbirth at that time. And to help with the sort of family income, it was quite common for children to start work at 10. They were supposed to get permission, but I'm not sure whether many of them did. I think a blind eye was turned to a lot of children working these hours in the mill at that time. The boys here would probably be the half-timers. Some of them will only look 10 or 11, 12 at the most. My grandfather had schooling in the afternoon after he'd worked in the mill in the morning, but that was scanty, and he very often fell asleep during the lessons and got a clip round the ear for his trouble of falling asleep. He'd been up since 6 o'clock in the morning working in the mill. My grandfather left school at 12 to work full-time in the mill. So by today's standards, his education was virtually nil, really. But he overcame that in later life. And was very, very well educated by the time he was in his middle age, shall we say. I think he worked at 5 or 6 mills in his career before eventually he was made manager of the Borough Spinning Company in the late 1930s, and he then was co-opted onto the board of directors, which, considering his early life, was a wonderful achievement.
For people like William Waterhouse, the 1900s were a time of relative prosperity. Britain was still an imperial power, as well as being the world's largest exporter of goods. The biggest export market was cotton to India and China. Bizarre though it may seem today, raw cotton was imported from America, spun and woven into cloth in Lancashire, and then exported to India and the Far East. Cotton made the Lancashire mill owners rich, and it also created a relatively wealthy working class with its own distinct culture. However, ordinary workers had few employment rights and there was no welfare state. There wasn't even a political party campaigning solely for them. The Labour Party was only founded in 1906. This film is of Haslam's cotton mill in Colne, Lancashire. It was shot on Monday the 29th of January 1900 at midday. These men, women and children who work there have just finished half of a 12-hour day and they're on their way home to lunch. They lived very close to the mill. You can see their houses stretching away in the distance. All these workers are wearing clogs with wooden and metal soles. And although the film is silent, the actual sound of all these clogs on the cobbles would have been deafening. And now it's very quiet here. The mill survives, but the workers' housing has gone, along with the 1,000 men, women and children employed here. This is where they worked. This is where the cotton weaving machines were. This splendid but now rather forlorn space. The unusual thing about the cotton mill, and this seems very odd to us now, is that here men and women work together in the same space. Very unusual in 1900. Indeed, women usually worked until they got married and then they would stop. But in the cotton industry, women would work, often full-time, from the age of 12, and then would be married, have children, and then return to the mill. And then eventually worked alongside their own children, I suppose. These Lancashire women weavers were amongst the highest paid women in industry, earning almost as much as the men they worked alongside. But the majority of women were only earning about 40% of the unskilled men's wages, which is about £82 a week in today's money. The struggle to be a good wife, combining work, housework and motherhood, was exhausting and debilitating. It aged you. The women in these films who look like they're in their 70s are actually probably close to 50. Women could not afford to take time off during pregnancy, so they worked until the last possible moment, often giving birth at work. The children were looked after by grandmothers and neighbours, and, as you can see here, by older sisters, until they were old enough to go to work themselves. Many of them grew up with illnesses like rickets, as you can see by the way the man on the right-hand edge of the picture is walking. Poor diets and lack of hygiene led to eye disease. We think of mining as an all-male preserve, but women worked at the surface in some parts of Lancashire. These women, known as pit brow lassies, worked at the pit head, grading coal and pushing the loaded wagons between the buildings. Known for their independence and physical strength, they're also famous for their working clothes, thought to be highly unusual at the time. These lassies are wearing jackets and skirts over leggings. In other coal seams, they wore breeches or short trousers, thought to be very risque. The pit brow lassies were criticised for their lack of femininity, so much so that legislation was being proposed in Parliament to outlaw their job. There was outcry amongst the lassies. They travelled to London in their trousers to prove that their work gear was perfectly decent, and they won their case. Women continued to work the coalfields up until the early 1960s. These fisherwomen also had a reputation for independence. They're cleaning fish at North Shields, Tyneside. They had an unusual life. They travelled with the North Sea fishing fleet, moving from port to port, getting the fish ready for market after the catch was landed.